Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming. Welcome to the IoT Newsdesk Live. Thank you for joining us for our 5G Automotive panel. My name is Alana Moriel, and I am the Director of Marketing Platforms for the IoT M2M Council. Simply put, we are a trade association for the IoT, and we're helping in partnership with CTA to run this Pavilion IoT infrastructure along with some conference panels, mentioning this one in particular. So today we will cover 5G Automotive, Connected Cars Go High Tech, and our moderator, Matt Hatton, will take it from here to introduce the panel. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you, Alana. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this panel, 5G Automotive, Connected Cars Go High Tech. About a dozen years ago, I think, when I sat down with some people involved in IoT, and we were talking about, okay, what's going to be the big technology vertical that's going to really dominate this IoT space, or in fact, machine to machine, as we were referring to it then. What's going to be the big one? You know, some people were saying healthcare, some people were saying industrial, some people were saying utilities, and our view was always auto. Auto's going to be the big segment, particularly when it comes to cellular connectivity. And I've got some representatives of some people who are only too familiar with the cellular IoT space and experts on, dare I say experts, on the connected car space. So we're going to have an interesting conversation today about all sorts of things relating to connected cars and the ecosystem around that, what operators can do in the space, and all of those associated issues. But first off, I should get you all to introduce yourself. So I can start from this end. If you can introduce yourself, talk a little bit about who you are, what you do, where you come from.
Yeah, my name's Sheldon Foisy. Thank you very much, Matt. I've been working for bics, and I have worked in IoT for about 20 years on and off. And you know, all IoT has kind of evolved as a space, and we may be experts today, but things evolve so quickly. Who knows? You know, we'll be experts tomorrow. So yeah, that's a little bit of my background there.
Tony Guerion, I run the IoT sales organization globally for Vodafone, and we actually have spent quite a bit of time on the automotive industry over the last 10, 15 years indeed, so promising discussion.
Absolutely. It was one of your conversation with one of your colleagues that I was specifically thinking about when talking about that okay, which is going to be the big one.
Thanks, Matt. I appreciate it. I'm Thorn Vogel. I'm a Vice President of Automotive Sales for Aeris Communications. I've been working in automotive for about 30 years. You can tell some of the gray hair. And been working on OTA and IoT in auto for the last 12, 15 years or so.
Excellent stuff. Thank you all. Now, if you're like me, you won't actually have had much of an opportunity to walk the show floor so far, being stuck in meetings, involved in meetings. It's a positive thing, but I am quite sure that a lot of the conversation has been about 5G. So I want to start off by talking about 5G networks in general, but 5G specifically. So, I mean, it's a 5G panel. So what does 5G bring to automotive that maybe 4G didn't?
Sure.
Yeah, let's start.
So sure, we'll start from the left. So I guess, from my perspective, I've been involved in a number of different applications that were being developed prior in 4G. And when they were looking at sort of how they would think about developing connected versus a non-connected state, there was a lot more pressure put on having a non-connected vehicle, right, in case connectivity wasn't there. So I think with the advent of 5G, it opens up a lot of technical innovation for that vehicle as a technical connected platform to be able to develop different applications on. So I think as developers continue to build these types of applications, they're going to be able to move more and more processing to the cloud, more and more connectivity. So things like your NLP voice applications, you're going to have more and more of that basis sort of on the cloud than in the actual car itself.
But does that just come down then to pure bandwidth? The amount of additional bandwidth that 5G can provide, and therefore you can put all of that functionality in the cloud because effectively you can be streaming back and forth between the vehicle and the cloud.
Yeah, I think there's some of it to bandwidth. Latency is another aspect for sure. But in terms of the if you take a look at a lot of the applications that are being done on car, the data processing, they can move that off car, right? So it gives them more opportunities to have a faster bandwidth for a better user experience, sort of in seat.
Excellent, Tony.
Yeah, no, I think at the end of the day, 5G becomes the enabler for V2X. Latency is one aspect of it, but it has many others. And I think 5G will prove to be what needs to be implemented and what will eventually unlock all the value into the way mobility as a service will be reaching the market in the future. So 5G is really pivotal eventually.
Okay, so it's bandwidth and it's latency in the context of V2X. I'm going to come on to talk about V2X in a little bit. Thorn, other areas, have these two guys stolen all the thunder in terms of what the particular benefits of 5G are, or are there some others we should think about?
I think you think about the latency and the bandwidth, and you realize, that itself is an enabler for, many of the other use cases. If you look at some OEMs, they have, dozens of use cases, and they'll go out and they'll measure their vehicles across different networks and across different geographies, and they'll rule out which use cases and features they can actually enable, for their users. And that has to do with consistency. Does it work every time in every car? It has to do with bandwidth. Is it real time and I require, some more information around the corner? Is it latency sensitive where I want to be able to sense, construction cones, smart cones or smart vehicles coming that are emergency vehicles. So the latency is an enabler for different use cases. And I think OEMs, when you have a greater 5G capability, they can go out and test those use cases again. And you'll find there's a lot more real time, a lot more data sensitive, or intensive, I should say, not sensitive, applications that become enabled by the 5G environment. So it's those capabilities really enabling the use cases.
Predictability is huge. We need to make sure that OEMs have the capability to replicate, test, and bring to the market, relying on a consistent network eventually.
And that's the challenge, I guess, because people talk about the applications that have been enabled by the availability of LTE. Uber is typically one that's thrown out there. And if any of you ever relied on 2G or 3G connectivity for trying to sort Uber out, it's not a lot of fun. So it was ubiquitous 4G networks that really brought that as a viable app. Now, we're not at ubiquitous 5G connectivity coverage yet. So are there limitations? Clearly there must be, in terms of what the ambitions might be of the auto manufacturers in adding new products and services. So is it a kind of, you ain't seen nothing yet at this point, or no?
I think the use cases are emerging. I think that the development teams are working on those use cases, and so you need to test and try and make sure a lot of these features and functions that customers are going to be consuming and want and will drive their behavior. You need to test them out well before you've got the full capability that's blown out. So I think there's a tremendous amount of development and ideas that are out there, the pent-up demand, if you will, for that more consistent coverage of the 5G. You think about autonomous driving, and it's one thing, when you talk about fleets of autonomous, or me driving an autonomous car, or letting it drive me. What happens if a car gets stuck? 5G, there were some examples here in Las Vegas at CES, maybe 3 years ago or 4 years ago, pre-COVID, where they had remote operator services in a 5G-enabled vehicle, where the vehicle gets stuck by a construction piece of equipment, something unintended, the computer can't figure it out, so what do we need to do? And they actually had a remote operator, and that's something that you can see in construction, you can see it in others, but that's a great example of something I couldn't do in 4G. I just didn't have the throughput in order to be able to do that. That is unlocked with 5G, as a simple example.
I think let's remember as well that the product life cycle of OEMs is 3 to 4 years. So I think as they actually work how to implement 5G into the head-on unit, into the use case, into the customer experience, there is a journey. And I don't think everything is going to change dramatically overnight. This is something that will happen across a number of cars and generations of cars.
Yeah, the cars are a conglomerate of multiple technologies. We haven't even talked a bit about sensor technology or things like that are evolving as well, that as any one piece of technology makes a leap forward, it kind of enables the rest of them to do new and different applications. So I think there's anything where you've got something as an automated or an autonomous vehicle, you want to have a very approach driven sort of centric, where you're going to take small steps initially before you go all the way, right?
What about some of the other technical features? I'll get on to something other than 5G in a bit, but some of the technical features that you get with 5G, network slicing, for instance. Does this bring benefits for connected cars? Anybody got a view?
So I'm not the technical, network guy on the network slicing, but I had an OEM share with me that, in an emergency use case where something, they needed to update 1 million cars all at once, and they could have a prioritized channel to do that for a 0-day, security issue, for example. They could prioritize that over everything else, and so there's a clear example in that use case for. Where having that set aside reserved kind of network will enable that. Whereas nowadays that might be a challenge.
Yeah. Okay. Now you mentioned about the time to market for vehicles. Now, are the auto manufacturers therefore in danger of coming out with products that maybe are not up to date, not taking advantage of 5G in the way that they might have done, or is it very much a case of, okay, well, if you install the technology, you make that available, then the applications will be the latest, greatest as they arrive?
I think most OEMs actually know what they want to achieve with 5G. I think they're pretty clear on the roadmap. I think they're pretty clear on the use case. That said, it takes 3 years to actually make it happen.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, there is a cycle of developments that needs to be implemented before it can actually reach the market. And I think they don't have a choice to actually go through that cycle. That said, most of the OEMs across Europe have been actually trialing V2X. They have real case, been implemented in each of the market where they actually work. And again, I think there is a vision there. It's just that the implementation is not going to happen overnight, especially when you are in a world where the entire OEM industry is being challenged with the electrification of vehicles. And, it's just one more agenda on top of all the things that needs to happen.
So on the question of V2X then, where are we? We talk about ubiquitous coverage being required to support 5G or being very beneficial for supporting 5G. We're not really anywhere close to that for supporting V2X, right? How far away are we? And is it the cellular version, or is it DSRC, or what do we think is going to dominate? Sorry, another technical question, but I can't let you guys go without asking that.
But I think the industry has already answered to the question of DSRC or Wave versus V2X eventually, or the cellular version of V2X. I think eventually V2X will prime. Now, it doesn't mean that DSRC is dead. I think there is a lot of case where the dual mode chipset are being rolled out into cars. But I think from a scalability, CV2X is going to win, and I think the 5G Automotive Association is actually pushing into that direction.
Yeah. Okay. Some of us already mentioned autonomous vehicles. Thorn, I want to come to you on a question. So you mentioned about driver assistance for autonomous vehicles. Well, do we even really need 5G for autonomous vehicles? Because surely the clue is in the name. It's got to be autonomous, right? Is that not the case, or is this still going to be dependent on cellular?
Well, yeah, I think it depends on your vision of how you want the world to look,
sure.
Right? So if Matt, you're driving in autonomous mode in your vehicle, and I'm driving in autonomous mode in my vehicle, we can operate very well. But if everybody here in the audience, and we all want to drive in an autonomous vehicle, and we want to drive platooning at the right speed, and we want to optimize traffic, that takes a broader level of data signals in order to give feedback to the vehicle, as well as the vehicles to give feedback to the network. And so it depends on where you go. Right now, autonomous is going to depend on what's built on board, and the intelligence on board, and the sensors on board, and you'll eventually be able to to get more feedback from this light or that light. But as the city grows and expands those capabilities, and more vehicles are autonomous, that's when the network becomes more important. Right now, it's an onboard situation.
So autonomy works fine when there's only a few, but once you start getting into, some kind of tipping point, you need to have that network connectivity. Agree? Disagree?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I rode on a train with a woman that works for running the logistics of the Netherlands trains, and she asked a question. She's like, "When you're from auto, you're passionate about driving. Would you ever give up the ability to drive in order to come into a city?" And right now she says, our computer operates all the trains, and we do it pretty well. Although we're having a bad day that day, would you give that up? And I think, cities or municipalities or regional authorities, eventually will have that ability to say, okay, once you cross this line, you press the button and you go into autonomous mode. I think that's a major evolution that we're going to get to, but it's still a long ways off, long ways off.
And actually, Matt, back to your question of DSRC versus CV2X, I think this is the point. I think if you want to scale, if you want to go direct and indirect, if you want to enable the whole ecosystem behind V2X, I don't think you're going to have a choice but to implement CV2X eventually.
For every vehicle in a particular geographical area. Okay.
Now you are dependent on the 5G availability, which I think is also something that needs to be improved significantly.
Yeah. Or maybe needs to wait for 6G. Whatever that might end up being.
Brings us back to the line, how many bloody G's are there? Right?
Well, almost infinite, I'd say. Okay, I want to change tack a little bit now. Does all this mean with the shift to autonomy that we're likely to move into an environment of mobility as a service? We're going to own vehicles, and what implications does that have for the car manufacturers, for whoever's building roads, for taxi drivers, for the environment? Sheldon, if I can come to you on that one.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think mobility as a service is an exciting opportunity that not only the car manufacturers is looking at, but everybody can be looking at. And so I think, as we continue to move down this road, it's going to, I think there was something in the questions we're looking at insurance as it was on use, right? Mm-hmm. And I think, you're going to see a lot of innovation around other sort of use case scenarios like that. But I think at the end of the day, it's always going to come back to that end user in the seat and what adds value to them in terms of as a service. Mm-hmm. Just because it can be built doesn't mean it's going to be used by the user. So, in terms of being able to add value in terms of what people can add to the user's experience, I think that's what's going to sort of add into that mobility as a service. It's going to be application driven.
But it's not going to change completely? I mean, will we still have people owning cars?
Yeah, I think so. I think people are going to continue to own cars for the foreseeable future. I think there's an aspect where people will not want to give that up, but I think that's a cultural aspect that is got to change versus the technology changing, right? And that's always two things you're dealing with in any kind of technical innovation is the cultural aspect to it, right?
Yeah. Tony, Thorn, any different views on that?
Yeah, well, listen, I think OEMs are spending quite a bit of time on mobility as a service because this is clearly going to be a challenge from a business model for them. Will the younger generation actually want to own a car when you actually live in a highly dense city? I mean, the business case is really, really not obvious. So I think we've seen emerging a number of use cases. Car sharing is probably the easiest one, where mobility as a service is becoming real. But I think there's still a bit of work to be done there, just on the simplicity and the proposition to access to it.
Okay, sounds good.
I guess I asked the question of, what do you mean, right? Do you mean a multimodal type of transportation system that, I have flexibility and choices of what I take from a commute or a short haul or a long haul or a last mile
and just car as a service rather than ownership.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at the rideshare miles, I was in some presentations with vice president of sales from Ford at a dealer association once, and they were talking like, look at the miles actually driven in rideshare versus all these other miles. It's not really any more of a threat than a taxi was, right? I mean, we've had taxis and buses and shuttles. What we're adding to that is the ability to share your vehicle, or even if you lease a vehicle, if you look at Lincoln Company, for example, that's a fully, you get everything included for a lease, and guess what? In your application, you could rent that out to somebody else and share that over the weekend if you want to make money on your vehicle. And so maybe you're not end up paying for your vehicle at all, but you still have a vehicle, right?
Yeah.
Whether you pay for it or lease it, you still have a vehicle. And so if you have all kinds of transportation and you live in a city and you don't need a vehicle, that's great. But if you ever want to leave the city and you need a vehicle, then you can use one of the rideshare services. I think ownership changes. I think cities, they want to get their parking spaces back. I think they want to reduce that congestion, and so there'll be a lot of pressure in major urban areas to how do we reduce that footprint. But I don't think it changes fundamentally the cultural drive to own or drive or be free in those vehicles. I think we end up having multimodal, multi-share aspects with still a lot of ownership. Where we can drive those vehicles and how we own those vehicles within a city becomes different, I think.
Yeah. It may have implications for the car manufacturers as well, though, right? Because you've got something which is effectively utilized only maybe 5% of the time, maybe not even that, and actually that utilization may go up to 50% if you've got shared ownership models, these types of things. Now, you're probably going to build a different car, aren't you, as a car manufacturer? Does it not need to be more robust? It's probably going to only be on the road for 3 years, but it's got to cope with a lot more mileage during that period than something that's owned by a driver.
I think the mileage is a factor there. So you're still building it to a life of miles, right, or a life of hours, if you will. If maybe you're taking out some of those congestion hours, but I think OEMs, I think you still have a growing mass of people wanting cars. So if the fundamental question is, are we going to have less cars? Probably not. We'll just have less cars in certain areas.
Okay, interesting. Electrification, EVs, EV charging. This is sweet spot for IoT. Is there something inherent to electric vehicles and electrification that is going to drive IoT adoption in automotive, which isn't doing too bad anyway, but is there something fundamental about this EV landscape that means it's much more of an IoT-shaped space?
Yeah, I mean, an EV vehicle is more technically, I guess it appeals to a more technically attuned client, right? So I think you're looking at sort of from the IoT side, your connected services and things like that are much more attractive and more likely to be used by the end user in that state. Along with then, you take a look at the EV charging stations as a piece of infrastructure now that then you can also tether other services to, right? And so I think, between those two things, I think you have a very good tip of the spear into that sort of field for sure.
But is that just early adopter? Sorry, Tony, you were going to jump in.
I was about to say, I see EV as a huge opportunity for IoT and connectivity in particular, because if you look at the whole value chain of the EV, a car, typically, an EV car will consume 10 times more data. Because actually you're more talking about the software rather than a car, in the definition of a car today. And so there is a lot of OTA, a lot of over-the-air software update, map update, and a lot of things are actually happening there. So from a pure connectivity standpoint, and if you go to the charging point, very similar discussion as well, I think there is a huge opportunity for MNOs, MVNOs, and all the companies working on the connectivity. And actually, you can tell when you see all the players in the market going after all those charging companies, there is a lot of competition in there.
Yeah. Sure, I think Mercedes just made an announcement that they're doing their own charging infrastructure, right? And Volkswagen invested heavily in which Electrify America, I guess it was, right?
Yeah,
and even the electric generators, like in Canada, a lot of the ATCOs getting into their own charge stations. Like the people that are actually producing the electricity now are getting into that infrastructure play. So, a lot more innovation and different perspectives are coming into that whole region, right? So, yeah, it's definitely a point.
Okay, another change of tack. I want to cover as many different topics as we possibly can during the course of this 40 minutes. So that's overall connecting the vehicle. I also want to think about the application landscape that sits around that. So things like usage-based insurance, stolen vehicle recovery. There's a whole bunch of applications that sit around the connected car ecosystem. And we've been tracking these for a long time, and there's 10, 12, 15 of these that look interesting. Any that you think have been faster growing than we might have expected? Any that you think have been slower growing? How do you see that application landscape evolving?
So I think UBI, it really is an interesting one because there has been a huge number of connections. So if you go to Italy, for instance, UBI is actually something that is well established and something that can actually lead to much lower premium when you actually get your insurance. If you go to Germany, actually not interested at all.
Nope.
And so it's actually fascinating to observe that in UBI you've got Italy and the UK actually driving demand, but the rest of the countries are actually not really in there. So a lot lower than what we had anticipated and what we would have expected. And it's actually interesting to see that not all those business models are replicable across, footprint that tends to have similarities.
What's the status in the US? Usage-based insurance. Is there much takeoff of it?
Well, I mean, I think it varies on how that data is used, right? And so if you mean individually, am I getting scored by my insurance company and they're giving me discounts? We've had dongle-based stuff, available for a long time, and now it's the real-time data that I can enable through the partners, through the connected vehicle, and through the connected vehicle platform, right? I think that's growing. I think how that's advertised and incentivized to the end user still is the gap of where that comes through. I think the capability's there. I think the partners are there. Nobody ever came and marketed it to me when I bought my vehicle.
Yeah.
Had I gotten a discount off of my favorite, insurance that I had, I may or may not have done that. I drive a car that has EcoBoost, and I tend to use the boost portion of it. So I don't know that I want UBI on my car.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, it's interesting to explore why there might be those variations between countries. Is it just a matter of time until everybody moves in that direction? Do we know?
Well, I think it's going to come down to a certain degree to obviously as well what kind of discounts you're getting in different regions, what different kind of regulations come into play. So there's a lot of other aspects that come into that. But I think end users have to believe that they're getting a real discount because of it versus it's just something there to collect data and tell them when they're a bad driver to increase premiums, right? So
I think the regulator may actually have a role to play in the adoption of application like UBI. I mean, if you go back to why cars were connected originally in Europe, is because actually the regulator said you need to have an emergency button.
Equal, yeah.
Equal.
Yeah.
And so at the end of the day, I think the adoption of those applications that sit on top of the car and the customer experience may be impacted by what the regulator actually decide eventually. And with the electrification of the world, with the decarbonization of the world as well, there is a huge bet there.
Yeah, I mean, if you want one driver, if you pardon the pun, one driver for the adoption of connected anything, regulation tends to be the number one thing. Sorry, Thorn, you were going to jump in.
I was just going to give a use case. You talk UBI and 5G, and you talk enablement, and we're talking incentives and driving adoption. I had talked with a carrier, an insurance carrier who was new, used to be an OEM friend of mine, and we were talking about where are the risks within insurance. So you look at teen drivers, we want to put in geo-fences, we want to put in, rate limiters and things like that, but, still we go through, the teenager goes through a stop sign or is not paying attention or wants to touch the, the mobile phone. With 5G, you could have a teen driver coach in real time with UBI, and you could have an insurance company, providing incentives. Hey, in your route, I see you're going to McDonald's. You get free fries if you score 100% on your way, and I will driver coach you, all that way. And so you're giving an incentive. You're teaching the teenager to drive better. A better, driving teenager actually reduces all of our risk while we're on the road. And so those types of use cases, I think, where you're really incentivizing, you can see a direct correlation between the driving and the use of 5G, in this environment. I think that's a great example of where you can drive a very value-rich kind of behavior in that UBI.
Fleet services is another good example actually, because huge adoption, huge promises, and the business case is quite obvious actually from a B2B standpoint. So I think there are a number of use cases that are developing which are very concrete in the delivery of the benefit for customers that are actually going to emerge. And get the benefit of 5G and create the traction there.
And it's not just cost saving, right? I mean, historically we used to talk about IoT. Three things will drive IoT: make money, save money, stay out of jail, right? The regulation stuff. There's also a fourth one, which is be more green, right? Hitting your sustainable development goals, all of these sorts of things. You know, there's a tremendous potential saving in terms of CO2 reduction as a result of using fleet management and associated services. It's quite astonishing.
Yeah.
Really.
CV2X is an amazing driver for that, eventually.
Because it will be able to just optimize the
way you drive,
the way
you behave, the way you interact with infrastructure around you, the way you consume the infrastructure as well.
Another topic, commercialization of connecting vehicles. There was debates about brought-in versus built-in connectivity over the years. There's still some car manufacturers relying on brought-in connectivity, smartphone tethering, and so on. And then we have topics of things like bifurcated billing and multi-SIMs in vehicles. What's going to be the landscape, do we think, in the next 3 to 5 years? Is it going to be every vehicle rolls off the production line connected? Is it going to be that the user selects who the connectivity provider is, or does the car manufacturer do it? How does that work?
So I mean, from my perspective, so most OEMs have in mind to become data company, to actually try to monetize how the data actually play into the car. So eventually I really believe that car and connectivity will become one, and connectivity will always be embedded at the OEM and not the OES level.
Yeah.
Now, there will be certainly an element of, there is an aspect of the connectivity that is absorbed by the OEM, you know, map update and all the different things that need to happen for the car, but there is certainly an appetite to actually understand how to monetize the other aspect, and that may lead to one or actually to several SIMs or several eSIM or iSIM, whatever you actually want to call it. So yes, definitely one eventually.
Okay.
Yeah, I would see things moving. I don't see OEMs wanting to, you know, be their own connectivity providers. I see some carriers being resistant to eSIM technology, and I think it's kind of a lock-in, and they want to sell their own services to the vehicle. I think the carriers that want to provide a really good service and they have greater consistency and they want to be more open, and they want to win that kind of, you know, that behavior along with their rate plans. You know, I think they're more open to the, you know, to the eSIM model. You know, eSIM from a value, from a customer perspective, means that as long as my OEM is partnering with my carriers of choice, you know, if I have a great affinity towards, you know, my network provider that my cell phone is on and has been for years, then I can just add my car to my plan, you know, a carrier of choice, if you will, and that's the best value for a consumer if I have unlimited data on my plan and I can bring it to the car. If you look at that data, you mentioned the data, you look at the data flow for, you know, warranty, you know, early warning, you know, warranty. That's a huge, you know, that's millions or potentially billions to an OEM. If I look at the aggregated data that they sell from a usage-based insurance, it's you know, in aggregate for like a state of Nevada or the city of Las Vegas. How does that happen? You know, you look at the data, and there's tremendous amounts of data flows that, you know, that are going to happen, but that's not free, right? If I bring my own data to the car, you know, potentially it enables other services, or it reduces those costs for, you know, for the OEM. So I see this migration to being more flexible from the end user perspective, saying, let me bring my data to the car, and then you use it how you want. And I'll agree, hey, you can send me all the OTAs you want over my network, versus you having to pay for it, you know, for example.
And I would agree. I think the challenge is that the implementation or the execution is actually far from being simple.
Yeah. Execution's another thing. We're just looking at, you know, how it works, right?
So but in that kind of a model, surely you've got, there'd be quite a lot of scenarios where actually the user doesn't want connectivity services in their vehicle, and actually it's all about the auto OEM. it's just for performance data and doing updates and so on. And I kind of struggle with this idea of the user being responsible for carrying the traffic for the car manufacturer. I mean, would the car manufacturer not want that to be a separate relationship just for their own comfort factor, that they're always going to be able to do it? Or is it not quite that simple?
Well, I think, what you brought up there is that the nature of what the application is that the data is being used for. Like if it's critical infrastructure to this software platform as a connected vehicle, they're definitely going to want to be the ones in control of that, right? Because, we were talking about the consistency of the experience with the vehicle. If they don't have the ownership of that, then they're going to be losing the consistency of that experience. I think it's going to be one of these things where you're able to, it's going to be, you have that aspect to it, but then you have other options to bring on these other types of data paths to give you these other things, right? Whether it be, your phone, or whether it be an eSIM, it'd be that would be where I sort of see that additional opportunity for monetization. You've got your base level service, and then you have add-on services on top.
Yeah, I would agree.
Okay.
Yeah.
There's also a question of upgradability, right? You plug a 5G modem into a vehicle, and then it's got to sit there. I was joking about 6G, but I shouldn't joke about 6G, because there's going to be 6G, and there may well be 7G by the time whatever car is rolling off the production line now is being scrapped. So how do you deal with that upgradability challenge? Is it just going to get gradually less and less up to date as a vehicle and the connectivity within that, or do we anticipate seeing a rolling process of upgrades to the hardware within the vehicle?
Yeah, huge challenge. But honestly, I don't think it's a different challenge from 2G to 3G, 3G to 4G. Eventually, you need to work with the limitation of the hardware, and you need to actually make sure that your roadmap has anticipated those needs. And this is, I think, probably the most difficult thing for the OEMs.
Yeah.
Where is the roadmap of use cases taking you, and what are you going to do with all of that? So yeah, definitely a big challenge. I think from a ownership of the data, EU ICC or eSIM is actually helping a lot to give control back to the OEMs. But from a hardware and limitation of the head-on unit and the sensors, by the way, it's not only the hardware as the modem, it's also the sensors. I think there is a huge agenda there.
And this is one of the reasons why the car manufacturers have generally been the earliest of early adopters for the technology, because they know that they've got 3 years, 5 years of development time, and then that vehicle is going to be in the market for 10 years, 20 years, who knows what, right? You mentioned eSIM, Tony. One of the challenges around IoT at the moment is around supporting cellular-based IoT particularly. It's about supporting multi-country connectivity. Car manufacturers, clearly they'd love to just be able to buy from one company, one operator, and they'll be able to provide all of their global connectivity needs. Things like eSIM, potentially, well, specifically the remote SIM provisioning capability within eSIM, not maybe necessarily the physical item, but that functionality has some implications for that and might change the dynamics. But how do we see that kind of streamlining of providing global connectivity is affecting how the car manufacturers might approach the market? Or are they? Does it make any difference to them? Are they going to buy on a country by country basis? What impact does eSIM have, do we think?
Well, I mean, from my perspective, people I've talked to, the eSIM gives them a lot of flexibility, like in terms of having a set of hardware that then supports that eSIM. I mean, if they want, they can, someone leaves, let's say, the United States and drives to Mexico, they can download an eSIM with a local profile, and then they can still turn their car into a mobile hotspot for the kids in the back, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, so there is, again, the end user functionality of that is interesting. And then as well from a manufacturing perspective, your hardware is able to accommodate where it goes by basically just having that soft download.
So supply chain simplification is really a killer thing there.
It's a huge aspect to that for sure. And then functional wise, it gives them those additional capabilities. Or later on, they're not locked into a given carrier. They're able to continue to evolve their relationships with the providers and pick the best one that's going to serve their customers their best.
I think OEMs, most OEMs, if not all OEMs, want one provider because ideally, it makes their life a lot easier. However, I think you've got two types of countries. You've got the countries that are easy to deliver, where regulation are actually fairly consistent. And then you've got other countries, not to name it Brazil, for instance, where actually it's extremely complicated. Turkey, UAE, where you actually need to implement your solution very differently. So I think there is clearly direction where OEMs want to find one player. However, the feasibility of it tends to be very expensive. So the question is, how far will they eventually accept to contribute to that implementation? Because otherwise, they will actually have to make that selection case by case, country by country, for the ones that are difficult.
I would agree. From an OEM perspective, both from a scale and from a cost, the greater my scale and the lower my costs are from those data programs across the world, and it ends up being, those pockets where I end up having the problems. And so, what we've seen in practice is that some of those regions will get a regional local provider where you run into that gap of cost or capability. I think they clearly would desire a global program. In practicality, I think you end up finding some regional carriers that you need to use to fill in the holes, either from a cost or a coverage, perspective.
Okay, good stuff. And I've just noticed we're out of time. Gentlemen, this has been really interesting stuff. Can I get a round of applause? There we go. There's a small round of applause from the audience. Thank you very much for that. Gentlemen, thank you.
Thank you, Matt.
Thanks, guys.